can we look at the overview slide? Next slide. This is what we're going to cover. We're now going to have a very quick introduction to leadership. We'll look at some theories of management and think about systems thinking in relation to one of the prevailing theories of leadership and management, which is around scientific management, and think about what does that mean in relation to your leadership of change in a complex system, which effectively is what we're suggesting that we're trying to do with population health management. We'll then come out of that to think about, well, if we're working in complex systems, what does that actually mean for leaders and leadership within the system? We'll look at some examples of where that appears to be working and where we're getting some evidence around what it is leaders can do. And then we'll come back into, well, the so what of that for you as leaders. Next slide. Alicia, can we go to the next one? Hello?
I'm just... Sorry. Is that... There, okay. Again.
This is just a quote that I like to use to think about leadership, and partly because we often say about leadership that it's what happens when you're not in the room. And in a sense, one of the things that we're trying to do with a population health management approach is create change within a system rather than do for and to people. And I think that has some implications for how we think about change and how we think about population health management, that in some ways the test of this is going to be much longer term, and it is going to be when people are changing their behaviours rather than being changed by others, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of premise for this, and I also just really like the slide, the quote. Okay, so next slide. Let's look at sort of the context within which we're thinking about systems leadership, and there are two quotes that I want to use. As I say, we're going to explore this in relation to the scientific management approach. There are other ways of thinking about leadership, theories of leadership and management. So we're going to explore the scientific approach. The process approach is one people may have come across, which MBO is managing by objectives, which is around setting objectives for people and managing performance and reward in relation to that. It was very popular. It arose in the 60s and 70s, as indeed did the human relations approach, which looks at how do we motivate people, and both these have resonance. There are many theories of leadership in management. I think if you Google leadership, you get well over 1 million hits. And of course other search engines are available. But we're going to contrast two, which I think are prevalent and important to help us think about why a systems approach might be different and why indeed it might be difficult. Let's look at the context for this then. So first, this is a quote from NHS England in 2015 around the setting up of STPs. And they say this: systems leadership is needed. Producing an STP is not just about writing a document. And I won't read it all through, you can read this, but one of the things to notice about this is that it implies a fairly mechanical and linear approach to something that we might argue is much more complex and chaotic than is being suggested here. So there's almost an assumption in this that if we follow these 5 steps, bring people together as a team, develop a shared vision, program a coherent set of activities, and so on and so forth, systems leadership will be the end result. What I'd like to suggest is it's probably a bit more complex than that. And let's look at what the World Health Organization is saying about this. So the World Health Organization, in a paper of 2015 looking at person-centered care, said this, that in fact transformational strategies, rather than what we might think of as linear change, requires new forms of collaborative leadership that help to bring together multiple stakeholders through an effective policy dialogue. And the argument here is that this goes beyond a sort of stepwise linear approach and is much more about how we speak to the emotional involvement of people in the change that we're proposing. So how do we appeal to people's hearts as well as their minds. And I think that's a theme that I would like to hold in your mind as we go through. This is about hearts and minds, and certainly we're not suggesting at any stage that an analytical rational approach isn't needed, but that it's needed to sit alongside an emotional engagement that really understands where people are and how we mobilise people around what matters to them. So let's look at the notion of scientific management, because I've mentioned scientific management, and it would just be worth exploring what we actually mean by this. A bit of an overview then. So the notion of scientific management comes from this chap, Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was doing his work around the turn of the 20th century. Late 19th, early 20th century. And Taylor was an industrial engineer, and you may well have come across the notion of Taylorism. What Taylor looked at, he was one of the first people to think it was worth looking at what it is people do when they come to work and how do we increase productivity and efficiency. And if you think about the times in which he was observing people and recording what was going on, it was a period of massive change, but also massive industrialisation. And he said this, he said that we must be able to specify the tasks and then select and train workers for this task. So we can select and identify the best people to carry out each of the specific tasks. We will see a clear separation between managers and workers. So managers design the work and workers do it. And that it's possible to find the one best way of doing things, standardise it and roll it out. And although we can look at some of Taylor's ideas and suggest that, well, that feels slightly old-fashioned, it's not like that anymore, actually his ideas and his theories have been very powerful and compelling in much of our management and leadership thought. Let's look at his quote, which I love actually. Taylor said this: hardly a competent workman can be found who doesn't devote a considerable amount of time to studying just how slowly one can work and still convince his employer that he's going at a good pace. And you know, we can laugh about that and think, oh well, we don't still behave like that, but actually that possibly is underlying some of the ways in which we how and why people come to work. I have to say that in all the years that I've been working in the public sector, I've yet to meet somebody who was solely motivated by coming to work for the money. And in fact, we generally, people will talk about coming into this work to make a difference, and really important to understand what it is that's motivating people and how we can develop our understanding of that to enact change. So let's look at some of the implications of Taylorism and a mechanistic approach. The scientific management approach says this: if you understand the parts, you'll understand the whole. And we have mechanical metaphors, which we use all the time. So here are some of them. We need to step up a gear, meaning we need to increase the rate of productivity. This department runs so well, it runs like clockwork. That's part of the machinery of government. You will hear this all the time, and I'm particularly interested in this notion of, are we looking at top-down change or bottom-up? The suggestion in a system, and a complex system, is that there is no top or bottom. Therefore, these are mechanical patterns which speak to a way of thinking about how organisations function and how people function in organisations. And if we look at the next slide, we can see what the implications of that might be for how we lead. So, for example, if we understand the tasks, that is what is to be done, if we understand the hierarchies, so where the power sits, who has control and authority, and if we understand the functions, that is how things are to be done, we can basically manage and discipline by replacing parts like worn out clocks. So, for example, we can say, well, we have a shortage of band 5s. We need to put another band 5 in there. We can talk about the component bits of an organisation as if they're basically interchangeable. We can also make plans with timetables and penalties, so I would imagine there is not a one of you listening or watching this later on who doesn't have a plan at some level. And we use plans to hold to account, to reward, to penalise, and so on. And we can transfer ways of working from one setting to another, importantly, with equal outcomes, with equal chances of success. And again, that thinking is quite prevalent in some of the work that's going on within the system. So this notion that we can find the one best way, and then we can roll it out at scale and pace. Let's have a bit of a deeper dive into mechanical assumptions then.
Hi everyone, can I just ask if anyone who isn't PA muted, please, just because we've got a bit of interference that we can hear.
Yes, I can hear a noise in the background. I don't think it's me.
No. So if everyone could make sure they're muted, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Okay, next slide. So scientific management works very well in certain circumstances, and these are they. When the task can be very clearly defined, we know what it is that has to be done. And when the task is known, in other words, we've seen it before, we know what this is about. When there is an answer and it is agreed upon by everyone. When the person carrying out the task is not required to think on their feet, or indeed not required to think, just to do, when the environment is predictable and stable, and when the manager has the power to instruct and command. And although there are circumstances in which this holds true, my suggestion is that in much of the work that you're doing around population health, this does not hold true. So, for example, the environment certainly at present is not predictable and stable. When you're trying to work across organisational or professional boundaries, you very often don't have the power to instruct and command people to do things. And equally, there often isn't an answer, or there are multiple answers, with people holding to their own versions of what's going on here. Let's look at some examples of that. So we're not talking at this point about very simple problems. We could be talking about fairly complicated problems, ranging from throwing a rock. So if I have a rock and I know the weight of it and I want to get it to a certain point, and I know the wind speed and I know how strongly I can throw, I can probably predict with a degree of certainty how the rock will land. But what about if I have a live bird? I'm not thinking of the rather startled emu that's on this slide, but let's say a sparrow, which I can probably hold in my hand. I have to tell you, I haven't got a sparrow, but let's just imagine the sparrow. What would help me to predict with any degree of certainty that I can get it to a particular point? When I ask this question in workshops, very often the answer people come back with is, well, you could kill it. And I often think, yes. And that says a lot, doesn't it, about how we deal with complex problems in our systems. There are other ways of thinking about what I could do. I might want to think about what would attract the bird to go to the place I want it to go to. Another bird or bird seed. I might want to think about observing what it is the bird does and adapting my ambitions around that. There are other ways of thinking about it, and the issue is it's a complex problem. Let's look at then what we mean by that. So let's look at a systems thinking approach. This picture is of the solar system, which arguably is a complex system because of the degree of interactions. And I just want to define some terms for a minute. So if we think about what we mean when we talk about system, it's worth just looking at a definition. Alicia, can you move forward for me? So this was W. Edwards Deming, who was a statistician, an author, somebody who, again, like Taylor, observed what it is that organisations and people within them do and how do we make that more effective and efficient. And he said this, he said, a system is a network of interdependent components that work together to try to accomplish the aim of the system. The system must have an aim. Without the aim, there is no system. That's quite important when we think about systems leadership for a couple of reasons. One is if we want to lead across a system, we need to understand what is the purpose that people will come together around. And important within that is what language are we using. So, for example, if I'm working with a group of healthcare professionals, often the purpose will focus around the patient. But actually, if I'm working in housing or in the police force or indeed in local authorities, it's not about the patient. It might be about the resident. It might be about the offender. It might be about the citizen. So language is really important. How we understand our shared purpose in ways that connect us all to it is important. The other point to make about this definition is that it isn't saying a system is a collection of independent organisations which are managed hierarchically, which are coming together somehow in order to benefit a population. Deming suggests the way we think about a system is what is our shared purpose. And so that's a question I think to explore in relation to your PHM approaches, that who connects to this ambition, and have we couched it in language that engages all of the different stakeholders? Let's look then at what Peter Senge says about a system and how we need to think about systems thinking. So Peter Senge is a writer, a leadership and management expert who has written and thought a lot about what's happening in systems. And he says this: systems thinking is a discipline for seeing wholes. It's a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots. So what he's getting at here is that rather than looking, as Taylor did, at the component pieces, what we need to focus on is the relationships between them. If we're really thinking about systems, we need to understand how things relate and the connections between them and the patterns of change, rather than seeing component bits in their isolation. And so this contrasts very neatly with a Taylorist approach, which says, well, one component bit is much like another. So having looked at the implications of a Taylorist mechanistic approach, let's think about, by contrast, how does a systems thinking approach help us understand what's going on in organisations a little better? So I have to say, the application of systems thinking in organisational life and in the public sector is relatively new, but it rests on learning and research that's been going on for some years in other fields. So, for example, in quantum physics, in chaos theory, indeed in evolutionary biology. And in the reading, there's a lot of very impenetrable stuff around chaos theory and quantum physics, which is well worth spending a couple of hours getting lost in. I'm going to simplify it as much as I can, but it's worth noting this is a sort of fairly complex area. The assumption that underpins systems thinking says that human systems are living systems, so we can't control, measure or fix them as if they were machines. That's one key principle. The second principle is the principle of synergy. In other words, the potential for change is massive, but it's emergent and dynamic. So the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. So referencing back to Taylor and his notion that basically it's about the component bits. If we adopt a living systems approach, we're saying the whole is greater than that, the potential is huge, but we need to pay attention, as Senge notes, to the relationships, the patterns and the connections. And the organisms, living systems, are self-referencing. They act to preserve their own identity. So there's this notion of autopoiesis, and let's just explore what that actually means. So autopoiesis suggests systems are well adapted to their environment and will act to preserve their identity. And Don Berwick, who some of you will have come across, who is at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in the States, says system is perfectly designed to deliver the results it gets. In fact, I think it was Deming that said that first. In other words, systems are well adapted to their environment and they will act to preserve their identity. And this is just an observable feature of living systems. It's not negative, it's not malign, it's just what systems do. if something comes along that upsets the environment or changes it, the natural response is to kill it or resist it. And think back to the bird. What we do is try and make it into a technical problem. But there is hope. So if we keep going, if we're persistent, if we if the organism is held perturbed for sufficient time, it will adapt to the new condition. So there are some implications of this. This is in many ways a long game, and we need to think about where our resilience is going to come from. What might that resistance look like? Well, I've used one of the great management gurus, Yoda, to illustrate this. Alicia, can you? Yes, there we go. So what form might resistance take? So when you think about your PHM approaches, these are some of the responses that you might get. So avoidance, partly because of people's fear of loss. If we're going to make a change, there is always loss, and we need to understand, well, what is it people are losing? And that might be status, it might be power, it might be routine, it might be all sorts of things. Deflection or denial, well, I'm sorry, I'm not the person you need to talk to, you need to wait till so-and-so's back in, I'm afraid they're on leave for the next 3 weeks. Or endlessly delayed meetings, you know, that's a great idea, Jim, but we haven't got time to cover it on this agenda, let's do it next time. You get the point, that this resistance is, we would say, a natural consequence of trying to introduce change into a living system. So what can we do? Well, let's think about complex systems. Alicia, for some reason this slide builds, so can you just, yeah, there we are. Complex system is one in which, because of the number of components which interact and the difficulty in determining the boundaries, even knowing everything there is to know about the system isn't sufficient to predict precisely what will happen. So we persist in our plans and our desire to be able to predict and to say, well, if I do A, then B will happen. The suggestion here is that if we think we're working in a complex system, and we adopt a systems thinking approach, we cannot predict with any certainty what's likely to happen. Let's look at some other implications of systems thinking. Alicia, before I get into this, are there any questions around clarity? Because I'm conscious that I'm rattling through this at a fair pace. And you're muted.
I can't see any questions at the moment in the chat box, Belinda.
Okay, lovely. Well, I will crack on, but please do feel free to lob a question into the chat box, because some of this is quite, well, obviously quite complex stuff. So let's just look at 5 principles. If we adopt a frame of systems thinking for looking at what's happening in organisations and how people work, there are some implications of that which we might need to pay attention to when we think about adopting transformational change approaches of the kind that you're seeking to do in your PHM ambitions. So firstly, the notion of unintended consequences. So the suggestion here is that there will always be unintended consequences of whatever you do. And therefore, you can't always be sure what is going to happen as a result of a change that you've implemented. Why is this? Well, some suggestions here. Sometimes people think for themselves. They don't always do what they're asked to do, or indeed the sensible thing. And people make different assumptions based on the same facts and data. So we talk a lot in our PHM Academy around collection of data, but there's a question, isn't there, around what data do we pay attention to, and whose data, and whose view of the world are we looking at? People have very different ways of making sense of the same facts and data, and the example I often use around this is the financial crash in 2008, which one of the precipitants of that was the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, so 2 organisations that were selling subprime mortgages. And an economist at the time was on a news programme and said, well, you know, the economic model is absolutely right. We had modelled this correctly. It's just that people didn't behave according to the model. In other words, people had taken out mortgages that in many cases they had no hope of repaying. the model said people wouldn't do that. Why would people do that? Well, for all sorts of reasons that would seem perfectly rational from the standpoint of the person taking out the mortgage. So we need to understand other people's worldview and not simply our own worldview, and how they make sense of the world if we want to introduce change. And the example I use for this is the great management guru Dilbert, who is my sort of go-to, and this is ASOC, one of Dilbert's colleagues, who says, if I do a great job with the pandemic contingency planning, can I have a bonus? And the boss says, well, I won't know if you did a great job unless we actually have a pandemic emergency. ASOC says, so if there is a pandemic, I might get a bonus. I think we can see where this is heading, that there's one way of making sense of this, which is, let's start pandemic, excuse me, and I might get a bonus. Let's look at the second principle that underpins our notion of systems thinking. So this is the notion of predictability, and it suggests that we can't predict what will happen in one place with a degree of certainty based on either what's happened in the past or what's happened elsewhere. Mostly because socio-political context really has an impact. You need to understand the culture, the history, the identity and the beliefs of your place, and this is why place-based leadership has such an important part to play in systems leadership, because we know, don't we, that places are different. That's not to say that there aren't common themes and that we can share practice. Clearly we can, but what we can't do is say, well, it worked in Nottingham, so by extension it's going to work in Warwickshire. What we need to understand is, what are the themes, what are the things that are going on which we can apply to our own context and look at what we hope will happen. And then thirdly, predicting outcomes isn't possible only by looking in the rearview mirror. So years ago, when I was the chief executive, I was responsible for negotiating our annual budget. And at one point, I used to basically take last year's outturn and add 5% or 10%. And that was in a stable environment when it was pretty clear where the funding was coming from and what our activity would look like. Suggestion is, you're operating in a much more complex environment and can't predict what will happen next year on the basis of what happened last year. And part of the reason for that is around globalization and mass communication and the technological change that is taking place around us, which increases complexity. And the illustration for that is this chap sitting on his chair, who has just followed one of the precepts of when in a complex situation, what do? He's done something. He's not sure what's going to happen. Now, we can predict with a fair degree of certainty what might happen. He's going to get bonked on the head and it's really going to hurt. But equally, he couldn't he, get up and walk away? He could put somebody else in the chair. It could be that there's a blockage in the way of one of the dominoes. We actually don't know what's going to happen, and we need to understand this notion of unpredictability. And again, think about, well, the so what of that in relation to our PHM approaches. Third principle is the principle, where are we, of perspective, because if you think about the systems that you're working in, you cannot possibly see all of the system. And as we've already talked about, different parts of the system have different ways of sense making. And those other perspectives are different and valid. And the illustration for this that I use is the fable of the 5 blind men and the elephant. And the story goes that the Emperor of Japan, Alicia, can you to the next one? Yeah, the Emperor of Japan in the 5th century BC wanted to know what an elephant was like, and because he was the Emperor of Japan, he had to be the first to see the elephant. So he sent out 5 blind men so they could experience the elephant and bring back their experience. The suggestion here is that the man on top of the elephant saying an elephant is like a brush is absolutely right. From his perspective, that's what it's about. It's about brushes. However, the person at the tail end is dealing with ropes. And if you think about this in relation to your system, one of the implications of that is that you need to be talking and connecting with people who've got very different perspectives on this system, because if you press on with trying to organise better bristles, and create conditioner that will soften them, that's going to do nothing to tree trunks and snakes. And some of you know very well that you're at the soft and mushy end of the elephant, but we need to connect our views. So one of the implications for you and your PHM approaches is, how do I connect with people, and are we connecting with people who see this very differently? The fourth principle underpinning systems leadership is the notion that everything is connected. In other words, you cannot intervene in one bit of the system without it having an impact somewhere else. And this goes back to the notion of unintended consequences, that you will not know necessarily where the impact is felt. And excuse me, the example I use for this is thinking about the boat. I have to say that when I use this slide in workshops, everybody has a version of who the people sitting rather smugly up at the top end of the boat might be, and it's always different people. But what we need to understand is that if we're all connected as a system, what happens in other parts of the system impacts on us. And the notion is that we need to think about how do we connect around our shared purpose to make a difference. And the fifth principle that underpins systems thinking is this notion of collaboration and cooperation. And I think in some ways I put this slide up and it's almost, well, yes, obviously we need to cooperate and collaborate. However, one of the suggestions is that if we've come through and grown up in a mechanistic system that rewards competition, and indeed have governance and financial frameworks that support competition, this is more difficult than it looks. So how do we collaborate in ways that may lead to loss for individual people or organisations within the system? So if we look at the picture that illustrates that, that might make it clear. So these mice need to cooperate in order to get to their aim, which presumably is to get out of the maze or to get the cheese at the end of it. And the suggestion here is that it may not be ideal to be bottom mouse in this scenario, or indeed middle mouse, but at some point we might have to take the hit for the team. In other words, there will be loss for individuals, and we need to understand that if we're going to implement change. Okay, so that was a rattle through of some of the principles that underpin a systems thinking approach, which is one way of thinking about what's happening in complex systems and why might that be helpful for understanding the leadership implications of that. So if we extend this then to say, well, systems leadership then is applying systems thinking to complex issues. And Debbie Sorkin at the Leadership Centre and Sue Goss at OPM say, we're wrestling with a lot of wicked issues that shapeshift and defy resolution, which cannot be resolved by single agencies acting alone. And we're applying systems thinking to the practical reality of trying to achieve complex change. So when might we be faced with complex wicked issues? Let's have a look at what defines those. So these are issues where the solutions, if there are any, sit outside a single hierarchy and across boundaries. There's no defined start or end point, and sometimes you can't even agree on what the issue is. So I think the issue is about reducing unnecessary attendances at A&E. Somebody else thinks the issue is about better education. Somebody else thinks the issue is about poor housing. All those things might factor in. We need to understand that there are no right or wrong solutions. Instead, we need to aim for progress and improvements. The setting is uncertain, ambiguous, and volatile. Suggestion is that characterises much of the context in which you as leaders are operating, and therefore that has some implications. And there are diffuse and contested power relationships, many different motivations, and so on and so forth. So let's look at what we think that might mean, and the illustration for this is a map around obesity, which is one of the areas that a great many systems are trying to grapple with. And clearly there are multiple different stakeholders, multiple different influences, from education, from health, housing, poverty, employment, individual biology, sports and leisure, and so on. How do you then start to address this in a way that could actually deliver some change. And I think this also illustrates the point I made earlier about, well, where is the top in this system and where is the bottom? How do we influence change from top down or bottom up? And actually, going back to one of the sessions we had at the last academy, we might need to think about leading from the middle and leading across and laterally. Okay, next slide. So to reiterate and just to recap, we're not suggesting systems leadership is now somehow the answer, and that mechanistic or mechanical leadership and management is somehow old hat. If we think we are dealing with technical problems, and you will have many technical problems that you need to deal with, this is what you're likely to need: problem-solving skills. That might be analytical, it might be diagnostic, but an ability to solve problems and a solution mindset, a notion that there is a right answer if we can only get to it. We might need experts and people who've been there and done that before, so that we can borrow, steal, copy what they're doing. Clarity about the problem, preferably at the level of root cause and drivers, and clear goals and focus areas so we can keep track. Clear vision of the ideal money, goes without saying, and the very best technology. However, if we think we are dealing with more complex problems, technical solutions will only get us so far. Alicia, can you? Yeah. So if we think we're dealing with wicked problems in complex systems, we need probably some additional capabilities. We need sense making, which goes back to this notion that we need to understand how other people make sense of things. So we need to know our system. We need pattern intelligence. So what are the patterns that we can observe and that we can then influence as opposed to control? We need to be able to ask the right questions, not necessarily come up with the right answers. As leaders, we need to be able to not just tolerate, but manage through ambiguity and nuance. It's complex, it's not simple, versus certainty and clarity. And it's notable that politically we're going through some very complex issues, which there is a real attempt in some cases to reduce it to simple solutions. And I'm always, whether it's in your work or in whatever field, I'm always slightly suspicious when people say it's simple, this is what we need to do. Usually that's a pretty good indicator that it's not simple at all, it's pretty complex, and there are no right answers. We need to focus on where we are rather than some future ideal state. So what can we do here and now? And we need coherence with the boundaries rather than consensus. So what that means is that we need to agree who's in the system, what it is we're trying to do, but not necessarily wait for consensus around what is to be done. If we wait for that, we could be waiting a long time, because ultimately what we're trying to do is change mindsets, to really think about what is going on here in a long-term and sustainable way. So, final bit of this is to look at what do we know about where this is delivering some difference in systems. And I'm just going to share a few bits of evidence with you and then invite you to think about what does that mean for you. So the King's Fund says this: leadership in systems is then the capacity to engage people and groups who are outside your formal control and inspire them to work towards some common goals, despite differences in convictions or beliefs, in values and operating norms. Let's look at some of the evidence around that then. So this hexagon diagram comes from a synthesis of a number of different papers and evaluations looking at what is it that leaders are doing in complex systems that appears to be delivering some beneficial outcomes. And you can see that there were around 7 simplified domains that people appeared to be working in, which were then further simplified into 3 exhortations, if you like. So firstly, to be courageous. Why? Because it can be risky to work in uncertainty, because particularly when you're in a leadership role, people are looking to you for certainty and to make decisions. But the notion here is that we need distributed leadership and decision making. To be curious, to go around poking your nose into things and poking fingers into things and saying, oh, what's going on there? And that looks interesting. And to draw on many, many, many and diverse perspectives and go out of your way to make connections. And in some ways, the academy days are a perfect example of an opportunity to make connections with people who may be doing similar things in different ways. What can we learn from each other? And there is a need for clarity, but it's clarity around the vision. So it's clarity around how you get people engaged in a common purpose, and it has to be underpinned by values. Let's look at some more examples of this, and we'll just run through these quickly. So yeah, can we skip to the next one, Alicia? Because that's, yeah. Just to think about, so question for you, to take away, I think, how, when and where are you at your most courageous, curious and clear, and what are the conditions that enable you to develop or use these qualities? And it's probably worth thinking about, and when are you not able to be in this space, and what gets in the way? And typically what leaders will say is, well, it's around time and space. I need time and space to explore this. The question then becomes, how do we create that time and space, which of course the PHM Academy days are designed to do. Quick rattle through some other examples. Yeah, next slide, Alicia. 21st Century Public Servant, a link to this is in the references, looked at starting in local government. What is it that people are doing, again, who are operating in this kind of systems space? And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that all of these functions, if you like, are known to be important. Very few are recruited to. So I'm guessing that most of you listening weren't. But actually what we know is that the ability to tell stories compellingly in a way that engages people is absolutely critical to enacting this kind of change across whole systems. Next one, Alicia. So this is a report on a program that was run about 5 years ago with similar teams to your own, so multi-professional teams coming together to deliver a shared purpose across the system, and this is what they found. And the things I want to draw your attention to, particularly around prioritised relationship building, and that's an action that we need to really think about. How are we building relationships? If that's what we know is important, and this comes up again and again, it's one of the common themes emerging. What are we doing to build more effective relationships? And you will have your own examples of where you're doing that and how that's developing. But again, another piece of reading that you can go and have a look at to think, well, what is this telling us? Next one. This is from Integrated Care Communities in Morecambe Bay, which is where I live and where I was involved in supporting these care communities built around GP practices. And again, some very relevant findings, very consistent, you will notice with some of the other research reports. Be persistent. It takes a lot of time to develop trust and a shared vision when people come from different tribes, in other words, with different identities, different beliefs about what's important. And again, doing this work needs space as well as time. Next slide. So what does this mean for you? Well, in summary, I think, if we accept the notion that a living systems lens is a useful way of thinking about what is happening in the systems within which you're working, that implies you need to understand yourself, your teams, your colleagues on the STP teams, and your partners, the people you need to engage with, are system leaders and enablers, so part of a wider system connected by a shared ambition. So how do we get to understand what our shared purpose is, and have we tested that out into the system? We need to hold ourselves to account. If we move away from the kind of hierarchical, linear, mechanistic approach, we need to find ways for the system and the system leaders to hold ourselves to account. And the suggestion here is the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. So do we have ways of calling out or naming unhelpful behaviours that, so for example, one of the ones that people often talk about is we get together as a system and we talk about as we've talked about, around governance and financial levers and so on, but we need to be able to name some of that. Evidence from the examples that we've given and from our understanding of how change happens in systems is that we start small, start where you are and use what you have. So let's not wait until we've got an ideal case with everybody who needs to be in the room. And there's this notion of building a coalition of the willing, which I rather think was coined first by George W. Bush in different circumstances, so perhaps we won't use that. But the notion that you need to bring together the people who are engaged around this, and that's partly because that's where the energy is going to be, and partly because if we start, that will then develop our learning around what's working in our system, which will then act as a useful model. Make connections and build relationships. So relationships come up time and time again. This work is built on relationships because it's about human beings, and human beings function through relationships. And so this is an active thing that system leaders need to do and think about, not building relationships in order that, but building relationships as an end in itself. In other words, digging the well before you need the water. And RCTs in this context means randomized coffee trials, not randomized controlled trials, which some of you will be familiar with. So randomized coffee trials, I think we've talked about them, but the notion of getting together with people that you don't know in the system and simply having a coffee with them. And the evidence from Nesta and a whole host of other places now suggests that that is a way to start building connections and developing a synergy that we talked about that becomes possible. And finally, just focus on making progress. This can feel like very difficult work for the reasons that we've talked about. We have grown up with and developed our leadership skills in a system which is predominantly based on a mechanistic way of thinking, and which privileges competition. And if we're suggesting that in order to deliver change in a complex system, we need to work more collaboratively, we need to build alliances, we need to work in different ways and let go of some certainties, that takes time. We are going to make mistakes. Mistakes aren't a sign that it's going wrong, they're a sign that you're doing something. So we need to learn from them. We need to adapt and we need to keep going. I'm going to end it there. There's sort of 5 minutes or so for questions. There are some references. And as I've said, I'm very happy to have a longer conversation with people if that would be helpful, because that was a rattle through some very complex stuff. Over to you.
So if anyone's got any questions that they'd like to ask Belinda, please pop them in the chat box so we can see. Don't be shy if you've got any question at all. I'm sure Belinda would be.
I'd be very happy to answer any question. And I suppose I have a question for you, which is, does this make sense in the context of what you're trying to do in relation to your PHM projects and your ambitions? If anyone feels brave enough to respond to that.
Belinda, it's Karen Bradley here. Hello.
Hello, Karen.
I've got a question. Oh, sorry, before I ask my question, somebody else has got a question, so let's go with theirs.
So, okay, from Bavna, is it?
So someone's saying that yes, it does make sense and it falls in line with my University of Birmingham MSc Public Leadership course.
Oh, good, good. Well, I'm glad about that. We're all talking about the same thing then. Always good to know that. But yes, I'm glad it does make sense. obviously some of this is kind of complex, and if I've suggested at all that this is simple or you know, easy to do, please don't go away with the impression that it is. I'm very conscious that you're working in very difficult circumstances, and you know, this is challenging work. So yeah.
And I think that's where my question was, Belinda, is
Yes.
was this kind of shift from very hierarchical process of you know, silo organisations to this system working, and so I was quite taken by your take small steps, because it's a massive shift. It is was my reflection.
It is a massive shift, Karen, you're absolutely right. And I suppose one of the confounding factors is that we're not suggesting it's a shift towards systems leadership and away from sort of mechanistic or hierarchical approaches to leadership. The real challenge for leaders is that it's both and so one of the things we need to think about, and I think is relevant for the STP teams, is thinking about within your teams, how do you address both and all of these approaches, because nobody's inviting you to suddenly stop worrying about the immediate challenges or about financial targets or about some of the governance regimes that you've got. So it very much is both and that I think is what creates problems, that when there's a tension between them, what we're noticing is systems teams will tend towards the immediate and the short term, and systems leadership is very much looking to the long-term sustainable systems level change.